What happens when a soldier taught to die for his emperor, to see surrender as the worst shame and the enemy as a monster, is captured and instead of rage, is met with something else entirely? Picture a train slicing through another world. The vast, quiet plains of the American Midwest, sky so open it feels like a different planet. Inside the car, Japanese prisoners sit in stunned silence, the endless green outside more alien than any Pacific jungle. Their minds are locked by years of propaganda. Surrender equals disgrace. Americans equal vengeance, yet with every mile the certainty they were raised on starts to tremble. Inside the train, rows of Japanese prisoners sit like statues, silence pressed into their faces. Outside, endless Midwestern green unfurls flat and calm, and somehow more alien than any Pacific jungle they'd been trained to love. Their bodies are here, but their minds are still locked in a different country. Years of propaganda humming in their heads, a litany of shame and duty. To surrender is disgrace. Americans are monsters who repay kindness with blood. Every unfamiliar farmhouse, every curious glance hits like a test. They hold their breath, palms white on their knees, waiting for the fury they were taught to expect. They brace for the hatred they've been promised, shoulders tight, jaws clenched, fingers digging into the cold bench as if to anchor themselves against a wave. In their minds, they replay warnings and propaganda. Surrender is shame. Americans are beasts. Revenge is patient and cruel. They rehearse final words, steady their breathing for blows they expect at any moment. Accept the certain slow, merciless death the newsreels promised after Pearl Harbor. Every stranger's stare is a sentence. Every silence feels like a drumbeat counting down. They ride forward, waiting for the first spasm of fury that, in their deepest certainty, must come. The train rolled and rolled, the rattle like a heartbeat counting down. Inside, the men braced for fury, the stories they'd been fed, the shame of surrender, the rage of a nation. They peered out at each station with clenched hands, waiting for faces to turn to knives, but it never came. Platforms glided by in quiet, not mobs, a woman with a baby. A man smoking by a fence. Curious glances, guarded eyes, but no shouts, no spit, no bloodlust, only the slow, disorienting absence of the hatred they expected. Instead, what meets them at every crossing is not fury, but a cautious, almost unnerving curiosity. Faces turned toward the cars with a slow, searching gaze. Not shouts, not pointed fingers, just people standing still, watching as if trying to read a story they've never seen before. The prisoners' training expects hatred, their muscles wait for it. Instead, there's a quiet watchfulness, the tilt of a head, the careful blink of an eye, the way hands hang loose instead of clutching weapons. It unsettles them more than any threat, because this kindness refuses to fit into the script they were taught, and they bring that confusion with them when the train finally stops. The train jolts to a stop. They brace for screaming guards, for a gauntlet of hatred, but the gate slides open onto a compound that is not a pit of torture, but a tight, guarded order. Concrete paths, rows of barracks, a watchtower that feels more like a rule than a menace, stark and efficient. It unsettles them. This measured humanity refuses to fit the brutal script they've rehearsed for years. The first shock hit quietly, like water seeping under a door. The barracks were clean swept floors, neatly made bunks, blankets folded with precision. Food arrived in real bowls, steaming soup, thick slices of bread, enough to fill a man, not the scraps and insults they'd been drilled to expect. That simple, organized kindness felt like an accusation. It unsettled them more than any threat ever could. Faces went still, hands hovered over plates as if touching a stranger's offering. A laugh tried to start and died. Indoctrination met ordinary decency, and for the first time, their certainty began to wobble. Night falls. The men lie stiff on wooden cots, eyes open to the wavering moonlight, the barracks reduced to silhouettes and breath. All day they catalog this strange mercy: clean bunks, regular meals, a kind of order that feels like a lie. The only living sound is the Midwestern cicadas, an alien chorus that makes the quiet feel deliberate, like a held breath. Memories of training come back in flashes, shouts, ritual, the punishment for weakness, so every small kindness tints the dark with suspicion. They listen, waiting for the trick. In the hush, whispers begin to stir. Whispers spread in the darkness, low and urgent, half questions, half incantations against what their training taught them to expect. Is this a trick? A staged kindness before the real cruelty begins? They trade glances in the lamplight, fingers worrying thin blankets, ears straining for the bark of a guard that never comes. Memories of lectures surrender is betrayal. The enemy shows no mercy rise like old wounds, then collide with the raw, obvious facts around them. Clean cots, warm food, a silence that isn't hate. Suspicion hardens into something else: confusion, shame, and deep at the core, doubt begins to fester. The days settle into a strict rhythm, efficient roll call at dawn, meals on time, tasks parceled out with military precision, but without the violence they'd been taught to expect. Walks under guard are just walks, not death marches. The quiet is unnerving. Men trained to anticipate cruelty now scan neutral faces for a hidden sting, bracing themselves for a trick that never comes. Instructions come slow, halting English broken into fragments, gestures filling the gaps so the prisoners lean in, ears and eyes straining to catch meaning. The guards stay formally distant, their faces unreadable, but there is no cruelty behind the ranks, only procedure and a kind of weary professionalism that confounds expectation. Small, confusing acts of decency begin to stack up like coins: an extra blanket folded neatly at a cot, a spare ration slid into a hand at dawn, a nod that is meant for comfort rather than contempt. Each tiny, ordinary mercy chips away at the story they were taught to believe. Another small, confusing act: a guard, distant as always, noticed a prisoner shivering and, without fanfare, held out a cigarette. A tiny, ordinary mercy that landed like a weapon against their certainty. Then the Red Cross arrived: plain trucks, volunteer badges, a stack of paper, and the permission to write home, and the compound shifted. Men who had spent months holding their breath over rumors now bent over pencils like it was an act of rebellion. A shaky letter became a lifeline. Some wrote with tears on the page, some stared at the blank lines, afraid to hope. For the first time, a voice from the other side of the ocean answered back, and that small, bureaucratic kindness, rubber stamps, delivered words, was another crack in the armor of propaganda, a reminder that the world they'd been taught to hate still remembered them as people. Then the order comes down like a hammer. They're to be sent out to work on local farms. The words slice through the half-light of the barracks. Pens falter. A cigarette goes out untouched. Men who have rehearsed brave faces for months feel something else, something tight and cold coil in their chests. Outside, in every propaganda reel they'd ever seen, this was the moment of reckoning, the enemy's fury, the villagers' revenge. For a beat, no one moves. The air thickens with old fears. Dark looks travel across cots, questions already forming in their eyes. They exchange dark looks slow, hard glances that pass like a verdict. Here it is. Beyond the uniforms and the watchful faces of the guards, they tell themselves, lies the real test. The vengeful heart of America. Months of propaganda tighten in their throats. Images of torched homes and angry mobs play behind their eyes. They brace, shoulders coil, fingers find imagined grips on rifles, wills steeled for the kind of fury their commanders promised. Every small noise becomes a threat. Every mailbox by the roadside becomes a mouth waiting to shout. For the first time since capture, fear tastes like certain private reckoning. They believe they'll face the farmers directly, men who have lost sons, brothers, neighbors, and every lesson they've been fed says those men will burn them with hate. So they brace, shoulders go tight, breath short, eyes hard as stone. They practice standing at attention for a verdict that might come with fists, with curses, with knives. They fold shame into silence and memorize the posture of the guilty, because in their world, surrender equals disgrace. At night, they whisper arrangements of apology and endurance, tallying sins they never meant, already imagining the verdict in the faces of strangers who have every reason to hate them. Trucks thunder up, diesel and steel rattling, and the prisoners climb in silent, rigid, faces hard as drumheads. The convoy rolls past barbed wire, a harsh boundary sliding by the window. Old vows snap into place. Honor, duty, readiness for suffering. Muscles tighten, breaths narrow. In their minds, they commit whatever comes next. They will meet it as soldiers. By the roadside, farmers line up by their mailboxes, quiet figures against mile after mile of fields, watching the convoy pass. Inside the trucks, the prisoners press forward, breaths shallow, hearts thudding like war drums, hands curl around railings, eyes searching for anger. They prepare for shouts, for blows, for hatred, made flesh expecting fury. They pass the mailboxes and the farmers waiting at them, and for a moment, every muscle in the prisoners' bodies tightens. This is the moment they've been taught to dread. But the farmers' faces hold no malice. Instead, there is the same quiet, watchful curiosity they'd noticed at the train stations. A tilt of the head, a narrowed eye, hands tucked into worn pockets, not fists, no shouting, no spit. Just ordinary people looking at the strange men in uniform with the wary interest of neighbors spotting newcomers. The sight throws the prisoners into confusion. The images of American hatred drilled into them feel suddenly thin and brittle, like film stock in sunlight, and an uneasy silence settles over the truck. They sit shoulder to shoulder, a convoy of bowed heads and clenched hands, and the silence between them feels like another order, rigid, practiced, heavy. In their minds, old films run on loop. Screaming crowds, bayonets, sweat and smoke lessons drilled into them until fear and anger were automatic. Outside, the landscape drifts by, and the faces at the road, women pinning laundry, men on porches hold none of those scenes. That mismatch gnaws at them. Some press lips together, some whisper names. One fingers a medal he never shows. They try to reconcile the enemy in their heads with the quiet curiosity on the roadside, and nothing in their training has an answer for that. The trucks stop at a farm. The first thing they see is not a weapon or a fist, but laundry on a line snapping in the breeze, white sheets, a pair of tiny shirts, a child's sock flapping like a signal. Their bodies stay taut, trained for hatred, but the scene is painfully, almost defiantly ordinary. For a moment, the world offers them something domestic, not hostile, and it unsettles every certainty they brought with them. The trucks slow, and the world outside seems impossibly ordinary. The distant hum of a tractor, the sweet, dusty smell of freshly cut hay, laundry snapping on a line, a dog barking somewhere beyond the corn. It should soothe, but it claws at them instead. Trained to expect rage, they read every friendly face as a threat, every quiet hour as a pause before violence. Silence becomes loud, eyes search for hidden fists. Every posture is a brace stance. Peace feels like a trap. They step down from the truck, tense and watchful, muscles ready, waiting for the blow that never comes. The first hours on the farm feel like a test, silent, taut. After the distant hum of tractors and the smell of hay, prisoners move under the watchful eyes of guards, hands awkward on unfamiliar tools, bodies stiff with apprehension. Every clink and footstep becomes a potential threat. They work in tense silence, braced for a blow that never comes, waiting instead for whatever this strange piece will mean. They work under watchful eyes, boots at the perimeter, rifles slung, faces unreadable, but nothing breaks them. No punches, no shouts. The labor is honest and grinding. Weeds pulled, fence posts reset, sweat and sun, and the small stubborn rhythm of hands. Still, every motion is measured, every breath held, because beneath the ordinary, there's a waiting for the inevitable violence that never comes. The sun beats down, heat presses on their shoulders, and the world narrows to the scrape of hose and the slap of boots. Sweat tracks salt across tired faces. They move in a hushed, brittle silence, each man holding his breath, braced for the moment someone will break and the promised fury will come. Questions hang there, heavy and wordless. At the midday break, a farmer walks toward the group. The prisoners go rigid. Hands twitch toward belts and pockets. Years of training compress their bodies into one motion: duck, defend, die. The air tightens into a held breath. They brace for a shout, a shove, a weapon. Instead, they wait, every muscle poised, eyes fixed on a single, slow-moving figure. The farmer comes closer. No weapon, only a battered metal bucket that sloshes with each step. The sound slices through the prisoner's taut silence. He stops a few paces away, shoulders steady in the midday heat. For a long, suspended moment, there is nothing but that dull, wet clink and waiting muscles ready for a blow that never comes. He says nothing, offers nothing but the bucket, no taunt, no glare, just a plain metal pail held out like a thing anyone might need. It sloshes softly, cold and heavy, smelling faintly of iron and the well. The water inside looks honest and sharp. The prisoners freeze, mouths dry, hands reluctant. Some shuffle forward to drink. Others watch, stunned the simplest kindness, rendering them inexplicably off balance. One prisoner, then another, hesitantly lifted the rim and drank. The water hit like cold truth, sharp, clean, impossible after days of fear, and for a moment their trained reflexes misfired. No flinch toward a rifle, no crouch for a blow, just the simple, stunned pleasure of thirst quenched. Heads turned. Eyes met across sweaty forearms, silence folded into a kind of stunned disbelief. That metal bucket and the farmer's open hand did more than moisten mouths. It cracked the story they'd been fed for years, sending a ripple through their ranks, confusion, shame, a new, dangerous tenderness. And the heat that baked the fields would soon test that tenderness again. Days later, the camp meets another kind of test, the relentless Midwest sun, turning the fields into an oven, sweat slicking against skin, mouths gone dry and patience thin. A young prisoner, no more than a boy, falters on a row of beans. His legs wobble, vision spots, and then he simply goes down, collapsing into the dust from sheer exhaustion. The sound of his fall seems too loud in the quiet heat. Around him, work slows, glances flash, everyone suddenly aware that the war's cruelties can be quieter than a rifle. He hits the dirt, curling up instinctively, every muscle braced for the kick or rifle butt, the standard punishment for weakness in his army, eyes squeezed shut, waiting only for the blow. He braces for the impact, eyes shut, muscles coiled, every muscle waiting for the rifle butt or the boot. Instead, a shadow falls over him. He peels open his lids, and there she is, the farmer's wife, stepping out of the farmhouse like someone who's come to fetch eggs, not to mete out justice, No shout, no scowl. Just a plain, tired face and the slow, deliberate calm of someone who measures grief with work, not vengeance. For a heartbeat the world tilts. The boy on the ground can only stare, stunned by an everyday humanity he was never taught to expect. She appears like an impossible mercy, holding a glass of milk and a thick slice of bread. The kind of small, ordinary things that somehow feel huge here. Her face is lined and tired, marked by worry, not contempt. And for a stunned moment, that detail cuts deeper than any insult ever could. The young soldier stares at the offering as if it were a challenge. His body still waits for the blow that never comes. Around him the others watch, breath held, as a simple act of care cracks the armor of expectation and leaves silence where fury was meant to be. She kneels and holds the glass and bread out with both hands, palms open like a prayer. It's a small thing, and yet in that sun-scorched field, it lands like thunder, maternal, unabashed, utterly unexpected. For a soldier trained to expect kicks and curses, a woman's gentleness is a new language, one he can't decode. He freezes, mouth half open, the world narrowing to the cool rim of the glass and the steady look in her eyes. Shame, gratitude, confusion, each feeling strikes at once and pins him there. Around them the work slows, even the cicadas seem to hush, as if the day itself is holding its breath. The boy just stares. A simple glass of milk, a slice of bread offered without contempt, without a lecture lands like a thunderclap. He expects a kick, a scornful word, the ritual of humiliation drilled into him. Instead, there is gentleness, a face full of concern and nothing else. For a long, clumsy second, his training and his hunger fight each other. Around him, the others go still, the camp's low hum dropping away. Men who learn to answer weakness with violence find themselves mute. That one small human grace fractures something inside them, not with words, but with stunned, undeniable silence. Little gestures pile up until they stop feeling like exceptions and start feeling like a pattern. A bucket of cold water handed over without a word, a slice of bread pressed into a shaking hand, a farmer shrugging off a broken shovel and replacing it as if it were nothing. It doesn't explode into some grand revelation. Instead, it grinds away at the edges of hardened belief until the images they've been fed for years of Americans as monsters, of surrender as the worst sin, begin to crumble. The enemy acquires a face, a hand, a tired, ordinary sorrow. At night, those small, dangerous truths are whispered under the covers as the men try to make sense of what they have seen. At night, the barracks became a soft murmur, low voices rolling like distant thunder, each man testing the others for a hidden edge. They replayed every bucket, every loaf, every unarmed approach, hunting for a trick, an insult tucked beneath the kindness. They compared notes, measured gestures against the brutal scripts they'd learned since boyhood, searched for the moment the mask would slip. But there was no mask. Only plain acts that kept repeating, water handed without a word, a soup ladled with steady hands, and with each repetition, their certainty wore thinner. Confusion, shame, a strange gratitude crept in, and by sunrise that unease began to settle into a fragile, unspoken truce. Weeks pass. A routine settles over fields and barracks' dawn roll call. The morning truck, the sun, the same chores, the same tired jokes in broken English. The tight, primed watchfulness that carried them here loosens, not with trust so much as with habit. Hands learn the same motions, boots move in the same furrow, meals are shared in silence. Small courtesies accumulate, water handed over a fence, a nod, a cigarette offered and taken, and with each one, the sharp edges of hate dull. It's not peace. It's a fragile, unspoken truce, brittle as dry straw, and inside the men, the old certainties begin to crack. Small mercies begin to add up, and with each one, a truth they were taught to hate peels away. For a lifetime, they had been forged into instruments of the Emperor. Surrender was sin, weakness was disgrace, compassion was treason. Now those absolutes wobble. Clean barracks, a glass of milk, a bowed head instead of a bayonet, gestures so ordinary they become unbearable. Nights fill with private questions and sleepy confessions that feel like betrayals. Some men double down, clinging to doctrine like a life raft. More of them pause, caught between pride drilled into their bones and a dawning, hollow recognition that the story that made them soldiers no longer fits the world they wake up in. The true turning point comes on a sweltering afternoon heat, pressing down like a weight, and a prisoner, clumsy with an unfamiliar American tool, struggles to make it do what he thinks it should. His hands are raw, his stance military, his instinct to act quickly so he won't fail. He leans into the motion, all force and focus, forcing the unfamiliar handle the way he'd trained to force an enemy, because doing the job right feels like the only way to keep his honor. Around him, the field quiets. Even the farmers seem to hold their breath. He pushes too hard. Crack. Then, on that sweltering afternoon, the awkward pull meets the resistant wood. Crack. The shovel's handle snaps in a clean, savage slice, the sound cutting the field's heat like a pistol shot. Birds stop. Men stop. The sudden noise lands heavier than any punishment he had imagined, and the prisoner freezes, muscles coiling, eyes already braced for the blow. He freezes, drops the pieces. For a beat, the world stops. He flinches, turns his head, and instinctively raises an arm to shield his face, every muscle braced for the brutal blow he's been taught to expect. Back home, the rules weren't suggestions, they were law, brutal and immediate. In his army, breaking something that belonged to the Emperor wasn't an accident. It was a crime against honor, and the punishment was designed to strip you of dignity as much as it was to hurt. A snapped handle meant more than a reprimand. Public beatings, ritual humiliation, men who once called you brother, turning into judges. So when the wood split in his hands, muscle memory took over. He flinched, arms up, ready for the blow he knew was coming. The farmer walks over. After the loud crack of the shovel handle snapping, the prisoner squeezes his eyes shut, muscles braced, breath held, every reflex primed for the blow he'd been taught to expect. He waits for the rifle butt, the shouted shame, the public contempt. Silence answers him. No shout, no raised hand, just the farmer's slow, even steps and the smell of dust and sweat. The absence of violence lands like a new, painful truth. The rules he lived by have just been quietly, irrevocably broken. He peeks open an eye, every muscle tensed for the strike. The farmer bends, gathers the two broken halves, and stares at them with a tired, almost apologetic sigh. No shout, no raised hand. Just a weary look that says, "Things break." The prisoner stands frozen, shame and bewilderment colliding, as the man simply turns away, small and ordinary as fixing a tool, impossibly human in the face of expected cruelty. There is no anger, no shouting, just a shrug, small, almost casual, an exhausted gesture from a man who has seen tools break and storms pass, and knows that some things are simply part of life. It lands on the prisoner like a verdict. He had braced for fury, for humiliation, for ritual punishment, and instead he meets this quiet acceptance, and it does something inside him that a blow never could. It pries open shame, confusion, and the slow, shocking recognition that the enemy can be tired and humane too. In that instant, the neat, hard lines of his training wobble. Ideology becomes fragile. He flinches, waiting for the crack to be answered with a blow. Instead, the farmer turns, walks to the barn, and returns with another shovel, handing it to the stunned prisoner without a word. There's no reprimand, no shouted shame, just a tired, practical exchange, as if tools sometimes break and life moves on. The silence is louder than any punishment. The hand that offers the replacement carries a truth the prisoner wasn't prepared for. Mercy doesn't humiliate. It undermines the old order. And in that simple swap, the soldier feels something like shame, soft, corrosive, and irrevocable. That night, the barracks felt smaller, the air heavy with sweat, and the low buzz of insects, and when he finally spoke, everyone leaned in, not from curiosity, so much as the need to anchor themselves to something real. His voice was raw, fingers twisting the blanket, eyes glassy. He wasn't terrified. Terror had been routine. This was something else. A raw, aching shock that loosened his backbone, an embarrassed shame at being spared, a dizzy kind of gratitude that felt almost like betrayal to everything he'd been taught. The confession landed like a stone in a pond, quiet, widening ripples, and left the men listening oddly unmoored. In the dim barracks light, he finally speaks, voice raw and small, the farmer's simple shrug. No fury, no insult, no spectacle hit him harder than any belt or bayonet ever could. It wasn't the broken shovel that stung, it was being treated like a fallible man instead of a dishonored object. Shame washed over him, not from pain but from recognition that the language he'd been raised on had failed him. Around him the others listen in stunned silence, the room heavy with questions. In that quiet, patient refusal to punish, something inside them begins to unwind, an ideological war turning inward. In that one quiet moment, no blow, no shouted punishment, just a farmer's tired shrug, the ideological war they'd been fed for years quietly fell apart. The armor of propaganda cracked. They stopped being faceless enemies on a poster and became, in a single, unbearable instant, fathers and sons and men who bled and laughed and missed home. The shame that washed over them wasn't born of pain, but of recognition that the human face across the furrow was not their enemy, but a mirror. It changed everything inside the barracks. Doubt took root, and with it, the first fragile impulse toward something like mercy. After the broken shovel, something subtle and unstoppable takes hold. Kindness turns contagious. One borrowed tool becomes two. A handed apple becomes a shared bite. Small mercies, an extra cup of water, a patient smile, a quiet correction in English, spread from hand to hand until suspicion thins into curiosity. Men who expected only brutality begin to risk soft gestures, a nod, a laugh, a clumsy word taught by a farmer's child. Even the guards, watching, shift their posture. The camp's hard edges round off. Propaganda cracks into ordinary human moments, simple, repeatable acts that pass from person to person until generosity feels like the new normal. It's a tiny moment, almost laughably small. One prisoner, fingers trembling, pushes a single English word into the afternoon air. Water. He says it like a test, like a dare. The farmer's wife doesn't flinch. She smiles, patient and steady, and answers, "Yes, water." The exchange is brief, but it lands like a stone in still water. Faces soften. A barrier that years of propaganda had built starts to show cracks. No speeches, no fanfare. Just a simple word met with a simple kindness, and suddenly the impossible idea of speaking, of being understood, feels quietly, dangerously real. In the dusty lull between rows of corn, an artist prisoner kneels and, with a dry stick, scratches his home into the soil. A tiny house, a sloping roof, and the soft arcs of cherry blossoms falling in a circle he can no longer reach. The motion is reverent, almost ritual. At first, it's just a childish doodle. Then everyone leans in, the heap of hands and faces growing still. You can hear breathing. The image pulls something out of him: memory, longing, shame, and the men around him soften without meaning to. For a moment, the camp is a gallery. The little picture becomes a map back to a life, and a farmer watching from the edge of the field follows the line with his eyes, as if trying to see beyond the sketch to the place it came from. The farmer leans in, squints at the crude cherry blossoms drawn in the dirt, then straightens and sweeps his arm slow and wide toward the horizon, past the rows of corn, past the distant silo, all the way to where sky and land blur. His fingers trace an invisible map. "This is big," his motion says. No words, just that patient, deliberate gesture, the kind of explanation only a lifetime on the land can give. The prisoner watches, chest tightening, the tiny paper house suddenly set against a country too vast to imagine. In that quiet, a whole language forms between them, no grammar needed, only the scale of a hand and the truth it holds. Words start to feel useless here, and that's the point. Communication transcends language. It's a weathered hand, tracing a horizon, a crooked smile, a stick sketch in the dirt that suddenly means home. Farmers and prisoners build a makeshift vocabulary of gestures pointing, offering water, a patient nod, a shared laugh over a broken shovel, and each tiny exchange chips away at the idea of enemy. What remains is another human face across a field. Those small, awkward, patient moments become proof that recognition needs no translation, only two people willing to see one another. By evening, that recognition will lead an old farmer to step forward, not as judge, but as father. One evening, as the sun bled out over the fields and the day's work slumped into quiet, an old farmer walked across the furrows and stopped before a prisoner who looked older than the rest. His face creased like a well-used map, his hands less steady. There was something in the farmer's gait, the careful, measured step of a man carrying his own private loss. A faded photograph of a young sailor, tucked inside his shirt, betrayed the truth his son was fighting in the Pacific. He did not come to jeer. He came with the slow courage of someone who knows what war costs, and he closed the distance like a man about to ask a hard human question. The old farmer comes closer, slower than the others, and without words tries to bridge a language that's not his. He makes a small, clumsy motion toward his own chest, then points, halting, at the prisoner, the question hanging in the air like a raw thing. "Family?" He says it again, softer this time, tapping his heart as if to locate the word for the man across from him. There's no accusation in his face, only a weary, human curiosity, an offer of recognition. The gesture lands like a stone in a quiet pond. The prisoner's eyes flicker, something behind them shifts. He understood with a sudden, sick clarity. Slowly, as if performing a private ritual, he slid a hand into his uniform and drew out a worn, creased photograph, small, corners softened by years of being folded and unfolded, his wife smiling, a child curled against her shoulder, both faces forever bright in that tiny square. He held it out with trembling fingers. The farmer took it without hurry, eyes moving over the image, as if mapping a foreign country, then up to the man who had risked everything for that picture. For a breath, there were no uniforms, no orders, just two fathers, and a silence that said more than any language. The farmer studies the crease of the photograph, then lifts his gaze to the soldier, holding it two tired faces in one frame, two fathers, the same worry carved into different skins. For a long, quiet beat, the uniforms blur. The ocean that once felt like an impossible gulf shrinks to a line on a map, and what remains is simply a man who misses his child. No slogans, no orders. Just that small human ache that binds them tighter than any flag. In that hush, something irrevocable shifts. The enemy becomes a life, and the rules they lived by start to feel strangely, painfully thin. Those handfuls of small, human exchanges, photos held up to the sun, a farmer's sigh, a woman's steady hand, offering bread, don't just soften them, they split them open. Inside the barracks, a quieter battle begins, less about tactics and more about identity. Who were they, if not soldiers bound to an emperor whose promises now ring hollow? Some men cling harder to doctrine, mocking the folk who hand them water. Others go silent, haunted by the picture of a child they'd never see again. Friendships are tested, loyalties fray, pride becomes shame. What looks like mercy outside becomes a blinding accusation inside, and the camp, once united by fear, is suddenly divided. Inside the barracks, the little mercies outside have done something dangerous. They fractured the unit. A hardline few scoff openly, calling the Americans soft, spitting the word like a challenge. They cling to old doctrine, honor, shame, the emperor's code, and wear outrage like armor, mocking anyone who accepts a hand or a loaf of bread. Their laughter is sharp, meant to wound. They parade bravado in the mess line and corner men with cold eyes, insisting that weakness is betrayal. The jibes land like stones, and already the bunk room buzzes with a new, bitter argument. Who is faithful to the old way, and who has been seduced by mercy? A fissure opens among them. Words sharp as bayonets cut the night. The hardliners spit accusations. "You've lost your spirit," they hiss, seduced by the enemy's kindness. Faces harden. Small groups form like islands in a cold sea. Some shout to prove they've not been softened. Others answer with silence, a stare that promises nothing but contempt. Tension coils through the barracks, quiet fights over pride, honor, what it means to be a soldier. Old certainties fray. Respect becomes currency no one can spend. And while a few rally, others grow quiet, withdrawn. But others go quiet, withdrawn. They stop arguing, they stop laughing. Instead, they sit apart, fingers tracing the seams of their uniforms, eyes glued to the dirt as if it might swallow their confusion. Small kindnesses feel like betrayals, an offered apple, a steady hand, a patient smile, and those gestures echo louder than any propaganda ever did. At night they wake sweating, haunted by two images at once: the imperial banners they were raised under, and the face of a farmer who gave them water without a question. The clash is raw, private, and corrosive. Old certainties begin to peel away, leaving them unsure who they are supposed to hate. Their entire worldview has been upended, leaving them adrift in a sea of confusion and shame. Certainties that once felt like armor, honor, obedience, the emperor's absolute truth, now rattle like empty shells. Nights are the worst. Men lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments of unexpected kindness until those moments begin to feel like betrayal. Some lash out, louder and crueler than before, because noise still feels like control. Others grow small and silent, tracing the edges of faded photographs and wondering if gratitude can live alongside guilt. Between the work and the quiet generosity, they drift toward a place where belief no longer protects them. Then, one afternoon, the thin envelope that had been whispered about finally appears smuggled through the Red Cross, stamped and folded, a piece of home in a stranger's hand. They gather in a half circle, hands fumbling with paper as if it might cut. Someone reads aloud. Others listen with mouths open and faces hardening like clay. The words sink in slow and sickening. Towns burned, trains stopped, families starving, silence falls heavier than any guard's boot. Tears come, not from fear for themselves, but from the realization that while they've been fed and sheltered here, everything back home is unraveling. The news is devastating. They hold the smuggled letters like contraband, unfolding brittle paper with hands that don't quite belong to them anymore, ink blurred by tears, words jagged with panic. Line after line describes cities swallowed by flame, streets reduced to ash, entire neighborhoods vaporized by relentless firebombing. There are lists of names, frantic pleas, accounts of children starving, of ration lines longer than hope. The barracks fall into a heavy silence. Some men drop the pages and stare at the floor, others press the paper to their chests as if it could still keep warmth. The news lands like a physical blow, hollowing out belief and replacing it with raw, searing contradiction. The irony is crushing and absolute. They hold letters that smell of soot and ash, reading of cities burned to bone and families starving, and when they look up from that nightmare, their captors hand them bread and water like it's the most natural thing in the world. It doesn't add up. All the training, the rhetoric, the promise that surrender means shame and brutality, suddenly it rings hollow against a clean bunk, a hot meal, a hand that steadies a fainting man. Rage, pride, duty, each one phrase. If the enemy can be gentle while their own country burns, what has their ideology really been protecting? It hits them like a physical blow. The proud banners, the oaths to the emperor, none of it could shield their families from fire and hunger back home. They clutch letters with ash-streaked headlines and stare at the simple, unbearable fact beside them. Here, across the barbed wire, men and women press bread and cold water into their hands. Humiliation and gratitude twist together. The rituals that built them crumble with every unarmed gesture of care. Shame blooms where loyalty used to be. And in that small, impossible kindness, they begin to see a different kind of power, one that will make everything they were taught start to fall away. In that moment, the world they'd been taught to live for simply unraveled. Their old ideology wasn't just shaken, it became meaningless. They watched, stunned, as the people who held them fed them, replaced a broken shovel, and offered water without a lecture or a threat. What hit them was this: power didn't look like thunder or conquest. It looked like steady hands and small mercies that preserved life and dignity. Shame and relief tangled together. Their identities as invincible warriors gave way to something quieter and harder to bear, the knowledge that their enemies had been stronger in a way that textbooks never taught them. It isn't just in its factories and warships. It's in the quiet dignity of ordinary people who, despite their own grief, refuse to answer hatred with more hatred. Not thunderous power, but a stubborn small mercy. A bucket of cold water, a loaf of bread, a hand that helps instead of strikes. For prisoners raised to worship sacrifice and shame, that restraint is a revelation more disarming than any artillery, more shaming than any defeat. It redefines strength as something slower and stranger, the courage to be kind when every bone wants to punish, to hold grief without turning it into cruelty. The news traveled through the camp like a thunderclap. A guard pinned a notice to the board, the words read aloud, and everything stopped. Men froze mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-task. Some read it again as if repetition could make it false. Japan has surrendered, but the letters sank in like weights. For many, it wasn't relief. It was a physical collapse, the world they'd trained and died for crumbling in an instant. Tears slipped where pride had lived. Others stood stone still, staring at nothing, as if the sky owed them an explanation. In that stunned silence, the war outside finally caught up with the men inside. For the prisoners, the moment is one of profound devastation. Their world is gone. Their cause is lost. Their God-Emperor has been humbled, an idea they were taught to kneel to die for, now thinned to rumor and ash. Men who measured themselves by ritual and obedience find their measures erased in an instant. Uniforms hang like costumes. Orders turn to silence. The maps of honor they carried in their chests are torn. Some stare at their hands as if the hands had betrayed them. Others press palm prints to their faces and weep, not from fear, but from a grief that is not anger, but a hollow, sudden emptiness. Many weep openly, not for themselves, but for the death of the Japan they knew. Streets and homes turn to ash, the Emperor's promises reduced to dust. The rituals and meanings that once steadied them now ghost quiet. They grieve for mothers who will not warm bowls of rice, for children whose laughter has been swallowed by smoke, for a flag that survives only in a creased photograph. Uniforms feel hollow on their backs. Medals feel like mockery. This is not private sorrow, but a communal unmaking, a waking into absence that fills every chest. And yet, threaded through that collapse, a strange, softer note rises. Relief that they have lived to see the end. And yet, beneath the devastation, there is a strange and undeniable relief. They are alive. The killing has stopped. For a few stunned breaths, the world reduces to the simplest facts of being: breath in, breath out. No gunfire, no roaring orders, no last screams. Relief arrives like an awkward, guilty guest, soft, unwelcome, impossible to fully embrace. Some wipe ash and tears from their faces. Others laugh, thin and broken, because what else is left to do? It is not joy. It is a raw, complicated unburdening that leaves them hollow and strangely free. An empty space where the language of being a man, a father, a son might slowly start to grow again. The uniforms and slogans that had shaped every thought were suddenly hollow. Their identities as soldiers were shattered, but something older, quieter remained: the ache of a father who missed his child, the memory of a mother's hands, the small domestic rituals that make a life worth living. Those things couldn't be erased by a surrender. They lived in folded photographs, in whispered names at night, in the reflex to comfort rather than to strike. That humble human residue left them exposed and, paradoxically, recognizable. In those final weeks on the farms, that recognition began to do the work words never could. In their final weeks on the farms, something quiet settles over both groups, not friendship exactly, but a recognition that runs deeper than language. They move around each other with the easy choreography of people who have learned the same work: passing a wheelbarrow, steadying a ladder, sharing the sweep of a haystack. Hands that once gripped rifles now calluses over the same tools, palms brushing in passing, eyes meeting and holding without explanation. At supper they trade a piece of bread. In the fields they fall into the same rhythm. There are no long speeches, no proclamations, just looks, small courtesies, and a mutual understanding so full it makes words unnecessary. They don't need words. A single look crosses the field of harvested corn brief, hard as sunlight on cut stalks, and it carries everything: the long, dull ache of loss, the quiet pride of survival, the shame and relief that war left behind. In that glance, the farmer sees a father he might have been. The prisoner sees a son he might have raised. Sorrow and respect fold into one gesture. Past enemies stand shoulder to shoulder, thinly divided by uniforms and oceans, but joined by the same exhausted human fatigue. For a moment, the war becomes background noise, and what remains is simply two men who know what it means to endure. They are no longer captors and captives. Standing in the late light of a Midwestern evening, They have become simply men from two different worlds who have weathered the same storm. The uniform lines blur against sunburned skin and calloused hands, against the dirt on their boots and the tired way everyone squints into the horizon. There is no triumph in these faces, only recognition of loss, of hunger, of the small mercies that kept them alive. A nod, a shared smoke, a passed bucket. The war recedes like a distant thunder. What remains is a quiet, stubborn fellowship that will follow them home long after the train fades. The day of departure arrives. They are marched to the train station, the same narrow road, the same cracked mailbox, the same wooden fence they had fled past in terror weeks before. Each step feels impossible, like a muscle memory from war, now weighted with months of doubt. Men trained to die walk hollow, carrying more than blankets. They carry shame, memory, and an impossible story. They look up for anger and find only faces turned toward them. The place where fear had lived feels stranger, for it's quiet. The fields hum with cicadas, and ahead the low curve of the station waits, a threshold between what was and what comes next. This time the farmers they'd toiled for stand along the road, not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet respect that lands heavy and honest. No shouting, no triumph. Just sunburned faces, frayed overalls, hands tucked against the chest, slow nods like a salute. A child peeks from behind a woman's skirt. An old man tips his hat and can't quite keep his eyes dry. The prisoners press themselves against the train windows, stunned by how small, how human these gestures are. A dignity that doesn't need a podium or a speech, only the courage to meet another man without hate. There are no speeches, no grand gestures, just the soft, ordinary exchange of people who have survived the same storm. Men stand shoulder to shoulder on the sun-baked road, eyes steady, hands reaching out with small things: a bright apple, a braid of home-baked cloth, a wrapped bundle of vegetables, a child's carved toy. Each gift is modest and awkward, offered without ceremony, and that awkwardness makes it sacred. The prisoners take them with trembling fingers, not as trophies, but as proof that kindness can be as practical as bread and as powerful as any victory. A farmer presses a fresh, bright apple into a prisoner's rough palm, an absurd, simple mercy that lands like a benediction. A farmer's wife steps forward and, with the shy pride of someone giving what little she can, slips a small hand-carved toy into another man's fingers for his child. There are no speeches, no fanfare, just these careful exchanges. Fruit, a wooden bird, a bag folded in a woman's hands. Each gift is a quiet apology and a promise, spoken without words, a last stubborn proof that kindness can outlive the war. Then another family steps forward, pressing a rough sack of fresh vegetables into a prisoner's hands. Potatoes still dusted with earth, a braid of carrots, a handful of beans, simple food for a long, uncertain trip home. There are no speeches, no grand gestures, only the awkward, earnest exchange of people who know how little words can hold. The prisoner clutches the bag like a relic, his fingers trembling, the farmer's wife looking away as if embarrassed by her own mercy. It is small, but it matters. An unspoken treaty of peace, a promise that the world can be mended with bread and kindness. The train lurches, and for a long, held breath, the prisoners press to the windows, watching the faces of the people who tended them, not soldiers now, but neighbors standing in doorways and along the road, hands full of small, awkward gifts. An apple, a carved toy, a sack of vegetables. There is no triumph in those faces, only something quieter, respect, fatigue, a threaded sorrow that looks almost like apology. The men inside the cars feel everything at once: disbelief, shame, a gratitude that tastes foreign. The landscape slides by, but those expressions etch into them. Impossible proof that kindness lived where they least expected it. They don't see monsters in the glass anymore. They see hands calloused from plows, stained by soil, offering an apple, a toy, a bucket of cold water. Faces that once belonged to a propaganda poster are now plain, tired, familiar. A wife wiping sweat from a boy's brow, an old man squinting against the sun, a woman handing bread without pity or triumph. Those small mercies arrived like soft weapons, patient and relentless, and forced a reckoning. Here, on stolen hours of peace, ordinary people chose compassion over vengeance, and that choice rearranged everything the prisoners thought they knew about honor, shame, and strength. They are returning to a shattered homeland, but they carry with them an impossible, life-altering story. Behind their eyes rides a quiet catalog of small mercies: a bucket of well water, a broken shovel quietly replaced, a woman pressing bread into a trembling hand. These images will not erase the smoke they read about in censored letters, nor the ash that will meet them at the docks, but they will change the men who survive, soften the reflex to hate, widen whatever space is left inside them for doubt, for pity, for the awkward, dangerous seed of compassion. Whoever they become, they will carry that proof. Enemies can be human. It's a story that proves sometimes the hardest battles are won without blood. In those Midwest fields, surrounded by laundry and corn, men who were taught to hate learned something harder to unlearn: compassion. Small acts stacked up: a bucket of well water, a slice of bread, a broken shovel replaced without a word, and the armor of propaganda crumbled. They left for a broken homeland, yes, but with something no ordinance could give them: a living proof that mercy can outmatch fury, that a steady hand offering help can be stronger than a raised sword. In war's aftermath, that lesson is everything. They left the farms carrying more than a few parcels and a story no one back home would expect: that their supposed enemies had handed them apples and toys, had tended to the heat-struck boy, had offered water without a word of triumph. Those quiet acts piled up until the men who had been taught to die for honor found themselves alive with shame and surprise, reshaped into fathers and sons who'd seen another face of mercy. That experience would haunt them and redefine them for the rest of their lives. And it leaves us with a timeless question. In a world torn by conflict, where does true strength lie? In the power to destroy an enemy, or in the courage to see their humanity?